Welcome back to the Commander Table, everyone. Today I've decided to share my Tatyova Benthic Druid deck. First things first, let's take a look at the commander. Tatyova is pretty straightforward. She's a 5-mana 3/3 that gains us a life and draws us a card whenever a land enters the battlefield under our control. She's an uncommon, and at first glance might seem appropriate or even underwhelming, but anyone who's played with or against Tatyova in Commander can attest to how powerful she is when an entire deck is built around her. Last time we talked about building Boros in Commander, and the challenges that the white-red color pair face when it comes to mana ramp and card draw. Tatyova and Simic in general is on the other end of that spectrum. She sits at the intersection of mana ramp and card draw. We put lands into play, and we draw cards, which gets more lands into our hand, which allows us to draw more cards, and so on. Tatyova is the link needed to create a virtuous cycle between the two most important resources in Commander. She isn't so much a draw engine as the keystone that turns the entire deck into one gigantic draw engine. I don't run Laboratory Maniac in my Tatyova deck, but I could. This is one of those decks that, if left unchecked, can easily draw itself out. As we talk about this deck, keep in mind that it's not at all unusual for this deck to accumulate hands that are 15 or 20 cards deep. An important aspect of building a Tatyova deck is balancing the effects that facilitate our engine to allow us to get that overwhelming card advantage with the effects that allow us to maintain that advantage and then close the door on our opponents. As usual, we're going to start the deck tech with the ramp and card draw, but as so much of the deck is dedicated to these and they are so intertwined with the overall strategy, I'm going to subdivide them into more discrete categories. We start our ramp package off with some traditional one-shot ramp effects: Cultivate, Kodama's Reach, Wood Elves, and Nissa's Pilgrimage. At 3 mana, these are all great for ramping us into our 5-drop commander. At 6 mana, we have Boundless Realms, which is less like ramping than it is moving huge chunks of our library onto our battlefield and into our hand. We have a small sprinkling of mana dorks with Llanowar Elves and Jaga Treespeaker, as my Tatyova deck will ultimately be looking to go wide with creatures and has some creature synergies. Aside from Soul Ring, Thought Vessel is our singular mana rock. With the amount of cards we can draw and with little to no recursion, we want to avoid discarding cards as much as possible. The next category is one-shot land drops. These are Explore and Summer Bloom. The new card Growth Spiral would also do a fine job here, it's just a hair less flexible than Explore. Likewise, Urban Evolution could also be in this deck as a budget option. Next are our repeatable land drop effects: Exploration, Burgeoning, Azusa, Wayward Swordtooth, and Oracle of Moldiah. Getting more than one land drop every turn is what really makes this deck tick, and for the rest of the video I'll be talking about the other cards in this deck in the context of having multiple land drops per turn. This ability is so important that we have an ancillary set of cards that have similar effects. Sakura Tribe Scout, Skyshroud Ranger, and Llanowar Scout can all tap to allow us to put lands from our hands onto the battlefield. Boudoka Gardener gets a mention here as another option for the deck. I don't run it because it's quite easy to get 10 lands onto the battlefield and I don't want it to flip, but maybe I should be running it anyway, I'm not sure. These creatures can't activate their tap abilities the turn you cast them due to summoning sickness, but they do interact favorably with some untap effects in the rest of the deck. So this commander deck, when it gets going, can regularly play 3 or 4 lands every turn. We're going to make sure that we have ways to utilize them, because each time we do, we trigger Tatyova. There's no worse feeling than keeping a hand with Exploration, playing 2 lands on your first turn, playing 2 lands on your second turn, and then not finding any more lands until turn 5. To help offset this problem, we have a few effects that will stock our hands with more lands. Yavimaya Elder and Sprouting Vines are our one-shot effects. We also have cards that allow us to bounce lands from the battlefield back to our hands, but I can't justify talking about them in our ramp section, so we'll come back to them after we talk about our card draw. Most of this deck's card draw will come from Tatyova's ability, but that doesn't mean we can't dedicate a few slots to even more card draw. If we keep her alive for a turn cycle, Nissa Vital Force's emblem provides us with a redundant Tatyova effect. Tishana Voice of Thunder and Biomantic Mastery also restock our hands. I also wanted to mention Horn of Greed real quick. I don't have it in my deck, and while it would still be a powerful card to include, be aware that some of our cards don't work particularly well with it. Horn of Greed only triggers when you actually play a land, using one of your quote-unquote official land drops. it won't trigger off effects that put lands onto the battlefield like those of Burgeoning, Skyshroud Ranger, or Boundless Realms. Now that we've gotten that out of the way, let's talk about some of my favorite cards in this deck. Because of our abundance of land drops, this deck can make good use of cards that return lands from the battlefield to our hand. And you know what tribe from Kamigawa block does exactly that? That's right, we're running 2 Moonfolk in this deck in Meloku the Clouded Mirror and Aboro Breezecaller. Meloku provides us with a stream of spirit tokens as it does its thing, and Aboro Breezecaller can net us huge amounts of mana in conjunction with Nykthos Shrine to Nyx or a transformed Growing Rites of Itlimoc. Our other land balancing cards are Trade Routes, which is an absolute rock star in this deck, and the symmetrical effects of Mana Breach and Storm Cauldron. These last 2 effects go a long way to limiting our opponent's mana, and Storm Cauldron in particular is absolutely backbreaking. I encourage you to remind your opponents, if they're unfamiliar with the card, that they also get an additional land drop from Storm Cauldron. It might distract them from the fact that you just played a really mean card. Speaking of mean cards, Sunder. No, you're not reading that wrong. It is an instant. Alright, this deck's land base looks a little strange in that it runs so many basic lands, 17 forests and 13 islands. The reason for that is this card, Sasaya Orochi Ascendant. Sasaya is a flip card that requires us to have 7 lands in our hand to flip, which in most decks is a tall order, and when she does flip, she becomes an enchantment that reads, whenever a land you control is tapped for mana, add an additional 1 mana of any type that land produced for each other land you control with the same name as it. I'll let you read that again. 1 additional mana for each other land you control with the same name. That means each of our forests taps to add an amount of green mana equal to the number of forests we control, and each of our islands taps to add an amount of blue mana equal to the number of islands we control. Yeah, that's a lot of mana. I've yet to lose a game in which I've managed to flip Sasaya, and provided you wait until you can flip her the turn you cast her, it's not easy for opponents to interact with her, since the cost of her activated ability is simply to reveal your hand. If an opponent tries to remove her when her ability is on the stack, you can simply activate her again. I mentioned earlier that we have some untapping effects to go with our suite of creatures that tap to put lands into play. Kyora's Follower is our first, and that one's pretty simple, as is Seedborn Muse. Retreat to Coral Helm combos with Skyshroud Ranger and company very nicely. We tap the creature to put a land from our hand onto the battlefield, triggering the retreat, which we can use to untap the creature. This essentially gives us infinite land drops. If we have Storm Cauldron in play, we can tap those lands for mana and bounce them back to our hand, generating infinite mana. If we have Temple of the False God or Nykthos with enough devotion, we can accomplish the same thing with our other land bouncers. You probably won't be surprised to hear that once you have arbitrarily large amounts of mana and a hand that's twice the size of your library, winning the game is pretty easy. You can build this deck with a totally different win condition. You could run Helix Pinnacle, or Sands of Delirium, or Teferi with Knowledge Pool. The options are endless. I chose to go wide with creatures. My finishers are Craterhoof Behemoth, Throne of the God Pharaoh, and Epic Struggle. You might have noticed that my card draw of choice earlier was also dependent on having a lot of creatures in play. So far, however, the only card I've mentioned that can make a lot of tokens has been Meloku. But don't worry, there are many more. Avenger of Zendikar, Chasm Skulker, Hornet Queen, and Tendershoot Dryad are all creatures that bring buddies with them. Rampaging Baloths, Spore Mound, and Zendikar's Royal all make a creature whenever we play a land, and trust me, they add up very quickly. Sprout Swarm can make use of all of our mana and ensure that we can tap all our creatures for Throne of the God Pharaoh the turn they enter the battlefield. Colony Garden is an innocuous looking land that makes a 0/1 plant token when it comes into play, until you realize that you can potentially play it multiple times a turn. I like to plant my gardens in anticipation of that Avenger of Zendikar. Note that the Avenger will give all of your plants +1/+1 counters, not only the ones it makes. Let's move on to our point removal. Reality Shift and Curse of the Swine deal with creatures. We have Crossing Grip and Nature's Claim to remove artifacts and enchantments, and for our counter magic suite, we have Counterspell, Arcane Denial, Foil, and Thwart. Alright, we're almost done. A few last cards that didn't quite fit any of the previous sections. We have Courser of Kruphix, which is just a good card on its own, but made better with the infusion of extra land drops. The extra life gain is also a nice boon. Terrain Generator is a really cool non-basic, and in the event of mass land destruction, we have Splendid Reclamation. The Reclamation is usually at its best in land-based decks that sacrifice lands for benefit, like the Gitrog monster or Lord Windgrace. But you'll find that in the course of a long game, lands will occasionally find their way into your graveyard anyway. Another card you'll be glad to have in the event of a mass board wipe is Cryptolith Rite, another generically good card that has synergy with the deck. Before I leave you, I want to talk about working on a budget in Commander. This is a topic that's been talked about a lot, as Commander decks can range from as low as $25 to as high as $2,000, and the diversity of the Commander community reflects that. Some Commander players are kids who built their deck with allowance and birthday money and card collections that are 6 months old, and some Commander players are adults with full-time jobs and no dependents who have been playing the game for the past 20 years. I have no intention of ever sharing a quote-unquote budget deck on this channel simply because the definition of budget is so extremely relative. I do, however, live in the real world, and while I myself have more disposable income to spend on cards than the average Magic player, I have my own budget restrictions, and those are what I'll speak to on this channel. I try to follow a philosophy of budget consciousness. I'll spend more money on a card if I think it will give an appropriate increase in power to my deck, and there are no reasonable alternatives. For instance, I shelled out for Craterhoof Behemoth for this deck because the next best options for the slot are just not nearly as powerful. And on the other hand, I don't own any original dual lands because I won't spend hundreds of dollars to make my shock lands enter untapped without paying 2 life. I'll just pay 2 life. If you look at the deck list and see that I have a Misty Rainforest in here, that's just because I happen to have an extra one, not because I felt I needed to spend $50 to that effect. Bant Panorama will be just fine in that slot. That said, if you're looking to build a cheap Commander deck, Tatyova is a great option. Because of the power of land-based ramp and card draw in Commander, you have tons of flexibility when it comes to card choice. Your deck won't be as explosive without cards like Azusa or Craterhoof, but you'll still be able to build a robust deck, I hope, without breaking whatever your respective bank looks like. Thank you for watching this episode of the Commander Table. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and share in the comments a deck that you think gives a lot of bang for your buck. I'm always looking for new ideas. Alright, till next time, go have fun.